I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University. This is fall of 2013. This course is Thomas Aquinas Metaphysics, taught by myself and also Professor Andrea Robilio from the Catholic University at Leuven, where I'm also a visiting professor for the sake of this course. And today's lecture is for our 8th class, and it's on Thomas Aquinas on metaphysics, and in particular focusing on his De Ente et Essentia. There are two videos that I provide for you here. The first is about secondary literature and indicating to you which of the pieces of secondary literature I think to be the most valuable, and indeed one which I think has hit the nail on the head, so to speak, and really apprehends what Aquinas is doing. I want to make a few comments on that for you because some of this is in the assigned reading for today. The second lecture is much longer, and it's a précis of the arguments of the De Ente et Essentia, chapters 1 through 5. It was just got far too long to add 6 in there, essence as in accidents. But perhaps sometime in the future I will complete that additional lecture. So let me proceed then. And again, as I said, this is going to be on the discussion of the secondary literature here. So as we shall see, this short work on the meaning of terms and their reference as abstract or concrete, as understood with precision or without precision, as absolutely considered or as considered with being in the world or in the mind, and so forth, is an exposition of a coherent metaphysical approach to the natures of God and creatures by Thomas Aquinas. As such, it is a short but philosophically rich work composed by a young Dominican with considerable knowledge of Avicenna, Aristotle, and Averroes, and metaphysical analyses current in Paris in the early 1250s. There is some implicit, we will see in the treatise, there is some implicit understanding of what's going on in Paris, particularly in the thought of Bonaventura, or St. Bonaventure, whose commentary on the sentences Thomas Aquinas had read when he was doing his own commentary on the sentences. But let's proceed. First, I want to give you some remarks then on analyses of the De Ente et Essentia and its arguments. So we're going to make our own way through the text, of course, and the reasoning of the De Ente, but I want to keep in mind some of the secondary literature and the ways the De Ente has been interpreted. I want to just mention 4 here that I think are quite valuable. The first is by my former teacher, Joseph Owens, and it's set out in an article called Quiddity and Real Distinction in St. Thomas Aquinas. It's in Medieval Studies from 1965, a rather dated piece, almost 50 years old, but an excellent piece of scholarship. There he makes 2 statements that I want to focus in on. First of all, on page 2 he says, quote, "The exact character of the argument and the exact type of distinction it establishes may not prove so easy to determine," close quote. And that certainly is the case, because there's been quite a bit of controversy over the interpretation and even the argument style of the De Ente et Essentia. Regarding that issue of argument style, the sort of argument that's going on, the method to be used here, or that is being used by Aquinas, I note that Owen says on page 16 of that article, quote, "The demonstration is not a dialectical process." So he thinks that there's a demonstration of a distinction between essence and existence in this text, but he does not think it's founded on dialectical reasoning or is properly described as dialectical. In fact, as you will shortly see, I disagree with that and agree with Professor R.E. Hauser that in fact this is a dialectical work, and we'll see just how that works briefly. But let me tell you what Owens in fact is up to with his argumentation, which you can certainly see if you look at the article, which is, as I say, still quite valuable. Owens allows that Aquinas makes a conceptual distinction between essence and existence, or essentia et esse. But he says that the only way to make what is a conceptual distinction into what it must be, namely a real distinction, is to prove via efficient causality the existence of God as esse tantum. So that's the line of Owens. Now Owens thinks then that there's a way in which the establishment of the conceptual distinction here is a stage in a more elaborate opportunity to prove the existence of God. Now his argument is then if we can prove the existence of God as esse tantum, or pure being, then we can show that all of the things must be composites of being and essence. And so, but God alone is identical with his being, or God alone is pure being in that sense. Or if you like to put it this way, God's essence is God's actuality of existence. If that can be proven, and if it can be proven that that must be unique, then of course all other things must be composites of being and essence. And that would show then that the conceptual distinction being made between being and essence, and by conceptual distinction I mean a distinction that is in the mind, not necessarily in reality, then that conceptual distinction will be shown to be necessarily a real distinction, because everything else will have a real distinction of essence and existence in its nature, nature as an entity, whereas God will not have that distinction. So that's what Owens is up to. John Whipple, in the chapter 4 of the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas, entitled Metaphysics, provides a short version, a very short version, of what he's argued for elaborately in several articles and chapters. And I suggest you take a look at his CV, and I give you the URL for it there, for his other writings. In essence, what Whipple is up to is to provide an understanding that there are three stages here. The first stage, quote, Aquinas reasons that whatever is not included in the understanding or notion of an essence or quiddity comes to it from without and enters into composition with the essence. That's the first stage. So the establishment that something comes from outside and enters into a composition with its essence. The second stage, according to Whipple, is this. There must be some first and unique thing, something first and unique, quote, whose quiddity is its very esse or act of being. And then the third stage involves a proof of God. Quote, everything whose esse or existence is other than its nature receives its esse from something else. So if that can be proven, and we can prove that in fact God's very nature is the nature of being itself, then we can show that there is a distinction of essence and existence in all other things. Whipple thinks there's a successful argument here, and that's his own view. So he goes on to say, quote, in the piece on the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas, quote, since what exists through something else is traced back to that which exists through itself, as to its first cause, it follows that there must be something which is the cause of being for all other things by reason of the fact that it is esse, not esse plus something else. To reject this conclusion would force one to postulate an infinite regress of causes of esse. So that provides the argument for the existence of a primary first cause, to be discovered through efficient causality. This resembles in some degree what we've already seen with regard to the interpretation of Alpha Elaton, or Book 2 of the Metaphysics as well, I should mention. Whipple also makes this remark. Only after completing his argumentation for God's existence does Aquinas return, by way of contrast, to the essence-esse composition of an intelligence, so as to correlate them as potentiality and actuality. The argument for God's existence itself uses as its point of departure the otherness or distinction of essence and esse in all beings, including intelligences other than God. So this is the point of contention, really, and that is whether the argument is in fact there for the sort of thing that Whipple is doing. I tend not to be convinced, but Whipple has worked very hard at this, and not without good reason, I think. Another approach, or a quite distinct approach, was taken by Father Armin Maurer in a 1998 article in a Festschrift in honor of Professor Leonard Boyle, who's one of my teachers at Toronto, in fact, an expert in paleography and a librarian at the Vatican. And Maurer wrote this article called Dialectic in the De Ente et Essentia of St. Thomas Aquinas. And it seems to me that Maurer points the way with this, and points the way quite nicely, but does not get into the details of the argument to the extent that is necessary to really see what's going on in the De Ente et Essentia, and to see its sources, and together with those sources then see clearly the method that Aquinas is employing. Maurer, just a few remarks from Maurer then. First, he says, quote, the purpose of the work is clearly stated in his brief preface. It aims to explained the meaning of the terms essence and being, how they are found in different things, and how they are related to the logical notions of genus, species, and difference. It's very clear. Yes, obviously, that's what Aquinas says he's doing. He goes on to say, how are we to describe the conclusions of St. Thomas's dialectical reasoning in the De Ente? His whole argument is that this is a dialectical argument. You'll see this if you look at the article. It's among the things that are reading for the course meeting. He goes on, they are tentative and probable, as befits this type of argumentation. The reasoning aims to establish the real distinction or composition of essence and esse in creatures, and the existence of God as esse tantum, but not with strict metaphysical demonstrations. That is reserved for later in his career. Close quote. This is somewhat closer to what Owens is doing in his article, somewhat closer. Maurer continues in this way then. He says, this is toward the end of the article, in beginning as a metaphysician with an introductory dialectical account of metaphysical themes, Thomas was following the example of Aristotle, whose own metaphysics begins with a preliminary treatment of the principles of the science, using a method that is not demonstrative but dialectical or inductive. Moreover, this introductory material is generally counted as an integral part of the Aristotelian metaphysics. Of course, this makes great sense because one doesn't start with demonstrated first principles. Rather, not everything can be demonstrated, so there must be first principles that are foundational for our arguments, and those first principles are established to be accepted through dialectical reasoning. So this seems to be perhaps somewhat on track, but I note here that Maurer refers to Thomas as following the example of Aristotle. He goes on, moreover, this introductory material is generally counted as an integral part of the Aristotelian metaphysics. We can likewise say that Thomas's initial dialectical approach to metaphysics in the De Ente finds its place within his metaphysics. The editor of the Leonine Commission of the treatise remarks, Il est difficile de classer ce petit compendium où logique et métaphysique vont de pair. That's true, but perhaps it is more exact to say simply that it is a metaphysical work using a dialectical method. Close quote. So his assertion is that not all metaphysical work uses the method of demonstration. Some, in fact, use the method of dialectic, which certainly is quite clear from our knowledge of Aristotle. So what we've seen so far is that Whipple, Owens, and Maurer look at the arguments themselves, and they have their own understanding of the way the method is used. But the moral of the story here is that one can't truly find what's going on in the treatise, precisely what the method being used is, unless one looks closely at the sources of the work of Aquinas. And as I've mentioned in these lectures also already, that this is something that people working in the Aquinas and the Arabs project are doing. They're looking at his use of material from the Arabic tradition. And indeed, that is precisely the sort of thing that Professor R.E. Hauser has done in his article, The Real Distinction and the Principles of Metaphysics, Avicenna and Aquinas. And this is in an article, interestingly enough, in honor of Dr. Hauser's and my teacher, Professor Armin Maurer, Father Armin Maurer. And this was published in 2007. It seems to me this article has not gotten the attention that it properly deserves, because it seems to me that Hauser has, as it were, hit the nail on the head. Let me just give you look at just a couple of passages here with you. First of all, Hauser says toward the beginning, the place essence and existence hold within the structure of metaphysical science sets the argumentative strategy for establishing the real distinction between them. If the real distinction is a conclusion, Aquinas should offer a demonstration of it. If it is a principle, then dialectical argument seems in order. Avicenna had treated the real distinction in the course of his presenting his metaphysical principles in Book 1, chapters 5 through 7 of the Metaphysics of his Shifat. Brother Thomas used these chapters in treating the real distinction in the De Ente et Essentia. Comparing the two shows, I believe, that Avicenna held the real distinction between essence and existence in creatures to be a metaphysical principle for which he argued dialectically. not a demonstrated conclusion or an unargued thesis. Young brother Thomas then followed the vizier's mode of argumentation as well as adopting his doctrine. I think that statement is just plain correct. I want to provide now the beginnings of my incomplete précis on the De Ente and its arguments. The first conception of the intellect, says Aquinas, are being and essence. Now, as Hauser points out, this is to be compared with Avicenna, for whom the first conceptions of the intellect are existent, thing, and necessary. And as Hauser indicates, it seems that Aquinas wants to keep necessary out of consideration. For a careful analysis of the entire text in relation to the work of Avicenna and also of Al-Ghazali, who wrote a shorter version of the work of Avicenna, then I direct you to the work of Hauser, which, as I said, I think is right on the mark. But here we're talking about Aquinas, so let's continue with Aquinas and understanding Aquinas' text, and perhaps in our classroom discussions we can take up the issue of the relationship to Avicenna in greater detail. It's too complex and too long a story to be told here. So the first conceptions of the intellect are a being and essence for Aquinas, and Aquinas wants to consider how they are found in different things and how they're related to the logical notions of genus, species, and difference. So, chapter 1 is on a being and essence. We begin then with the meaning of being, says Aquinas, because it's easier to grasp at first, and then we'll consider the meaning of essence. Two, a being can denote, 1, what is divided by the 10 categories, or, in the second place, it can signify truth for propositions. We've seen this in Aristotle already, this notion of Aristotle, but it's in our own examination of Aristotle's metaphysics. Regarding 2, that is the notion of it signifying what's in propositions, note that what we mean is that something can be called a being if we can form a positive statement, that is an affirmative proposition about it. For example, blindness is in the eye. It's an affirmation of the presence of blindness in the eye. But of course, blindness is not a thing, it's a negation here, properly speaking, not a positively existing thing or a being. And of course, in this context, we should recall Parmenides and Plato, who say that we cannot know what is not. Section 3 of chapter 1. Consequently, essence or essentia is derived from a being, ens, in the sense of one above, that is, in the first sense, that is the sense of the 10 categories, says Aquinas. And he adds that the great commentator on Aristotle, Averroes, saw just this and agreed that essence is signified by sense number 1, that is, the 10 categories. Aquinas goes on to note then that some philosophers have used the term quiddity, whatness. This is from the Arabic mahia. Ma means what, iya means ness, whiteness, whatness, so to speak. And so we have mahia, from which quiddity, quidditas, is derived. And so some philosophers have used the term quiddity, says Aquinas, in place of essence, because a definition saying what a thing is does so by locating that thing in its genus and species. For example, what is a human being? A human being is an animal of the rational sort. Aristotle, in Metaphysics 7, often calls this the what something was to be, the toti ein enai. And Avicenna says it's the form, since the form determines what each thing is. Boethius, notes Aquinas, calls this the nature of a thing. So, according to Aquinas, we can say that a nature is what the intellect can grasp in any way, because the intellectual grasp or full understanding of a thing comes about only through knowing its definition and its essence. Generally, then, we might say that nature indicates the essence as carrying out a specific operation or actuality. Quiddity comes from the definition, from what the definition signifies. And essence is that through which and in which what is has being. So again, he's explaining the use of the terminology as he said he would in this important metaphysical context. Of course, essence, like a being, essentia, like ens, is used primarily and most truly of substances, not accidents, because accidents are qualified beings. And this is to say that they are dependent for their being on a substance in which they exist as being present. So they're present in a subject, and they're present in the substance. And the being that an accident has is a derived being based on the nature of the substance. Finally, in section 6, Aquinas has us note that there are composite substances like ourselves, and Fido the dog, and the flower, and there are simple substances like God and the angels. And also that he thinks that the human soul is in some way a simplified substance, or at least a separate substance, but we'll get to that shortly. But of course, both kinds have essence, since both are substances. Simple substances are the causes of others, writes Aquinas, as God is the cause of composite substances such as ourselves. But that's something we'll consider again later. Now then, given our abilities, which are directed toward composite beings of the world of the senses, that is, our abilities for knowing, we must begin learning with what is easier and more at hand for us, and slowly progress from composite substances to the understanding of the more difficult, which are simple substances. And this is something we saw indicated in our class. We saw this indicated in Aristotle in Metaphysics Book 1, the gradual progression toward things that are more simple but are more universal in a sense. And we saw this in some of the other discussions of Aristotle's metaphysics as well. So I'm going to stop here with this first lecture because, as I said, and I forewarn you, the next lecture is considerably longer and goes into detail with most of the De Ente de Sentia, at least through chapter 5. So I'll pause now with this, which is lecture 8A.